Day, don't got it domba, de don't be do damba. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It has indeed been a long time coming. This episode is going to be a tribute to my father, to the man who raised me. And if anybody who knows me knows that I have two fathers. I have my biological father, and I have the father who raised me. And this episode is dedicated to Robert Anthony, to the man who adopted me and raised me. And I'm going to do my best to try and share pieces and just kind of have this tribute to my father, more from the perspective of me as his daughter. Because I was absolutely, and still am, a daddy's girl. When I look at my life and I look at major milestones and just what his role and his impact on me has been across the board with so many things, I am eternally grateful. And he has inspired me in so many different ways that it, for me, was an absolute honor and privilege to be able to serve and to hold space for him in, over the years, I would say, but in the sense of this last year and his end of life transition and death, for me to be able to take off my hat as his daughter and to literally be able to step into the role of a midwife, death doula, hospice nurse, all the things, right? And it was an honor for me to be able to serve in that way and for him to have what he desired in the sense of wanting a home death. Right? So again, even as the midwife that I am, home birth is absolutely fantastic if it's possible and you can come into the world at home. I also think death is equally important if you can to be able to take your last breaths and to leave at home as well. So anyways, and his celebration of life, I will say this though, I will say that part of my role and my ability to hold the space that I did in 2023 for his end of life transitions, I personally, I was in Germany, and Europe just in general, but I literally had to grieve and process and have his celebration of life and death before I returned to the United States. I was very clear for probably the last couple years and was communicating with him in spirit. And this is, another realm. I think there's going to be another episode or podcast that'll just be on the metaphysical aspects of how you communicate in spirit, even if ones are in their physical body, how you communicate soul to soul when they no longer have the ability to communicate in other ways. So dementia, his reality and physical body, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, kidney failure, like all the things, in the sense of like his physical body was hung on for a lot of years and was not so beautiful. So this is why, for ones who know, when someone actually leaves their meat suit, when they have not been living for a very long time, it is a celebration of life. But my reality, before I even got on the plane and flew from Switzerland to Chicago, before I even left, I was preparing and attuning my own nervous system and body and grieving. I don't know if anyone has ever done that before, but where you actually grieve a person while they're still alive in order for you to hold the space. I do think there's a little bit of crossover there in the sense of midwifery, in the sense that there's a lot of things in your own being, in your own somatic embodiment, and in general, that it is important, if you can, to clear a lot of those things, because then you get to show up and you just get to be the vessel in the ways that you're meant to serve. So that was my reality. I literally grieved my father and had my own ritual, as well as some soul family and friends I remember having a celebration of life dinner. This was before I came back to the United States. And we went around and we were talking about, it's like, tell me your favorite memories from your father. And just in that, I did that while my father was still physically embodied, right? So, and when I actually arrived, the role that I could play and the space that I could hold was extremely clean, extremely clear. And I was able, and it was actually kind of, I think it was actually a blessing even towards the end that he didn't really recognize me, that he really did think that I was simply the nurse or the angel of death, right? I think it's beautiful because it allowed many things to, it allowed a different dance for him and I, because in his embodiment and before Alzheimer's or dementia and all of the other things, he was a very proud and stubborn man. Yeah, he was very much the provider, clear on what was what in many ways. But underneath all of that, he had such humor and such playfulness. There was like this childlike side of him. And those are the things that, if I'm speaking as his daughter, he worked really hard. He worked and again was the provider in the sense of like, here's, my mom, which that's another story even in itself. Her and I, we still even have these conversations that as much as they were married, she was pretty much a single married woman, in the sense that he worked constantly and was not, around a lot. But when he was playful, and we skied and we went on boats. I remember one of my first memories, well, not one of my first memories, but like we would, when he was home. Okay, so say he, when he had a Sunday off, one of the first things, or even a day off during the week, he had a rotating schedule. So he was one of his jobs before he retired, and then had other businesses. He had a good government job in the sense of delivering mail, right? That was, you got out of the army, and, that was one of the things, like you could kind of become a, mailman, cop, something, not higher education. That wasn't really condoned. He was a worker. Yeah, he was definitely a worker. And he would build houses, and so their first house, which again, even that one I don't remember because I was too young. But he was adamant to be able to do a lot of the things, and as much as there were maybe contractors and different ones, he was always part of it and participating in it. And he had dreams of things that he wanted in his life. So when he had a vision of living on a farm, he literally took all, it was his wife and my brother and I, and moved, and he got a farm. And still, even when he got a farm though, he still drove into Milwaukee and delivered his mail route. And so there was different things, different aspects of him, riding motorcycles, riding horses, like this, like he really had this motto of like, you work hard, but you play hard. And so my aspects in remembering with my father is the fact that we played. And he was really calm, and took risks in many things. So that's also, hence, how many mail carriers, mailmen, buy a little 2-seater plane and drive and flies the airplane and parks it at Timmerman International Airport, and then walks to the post office and then delivers his mail. Again, it was a little 2-seater, whatever. I think he said he paid $4,000 for it at the time. So again, that's also kind of the equivalent, like someone buys a car. Like, he had visions and dreams of things and he would make it happen. So I think on a level of even manifestation, there's a lot of things that he instilled in me that it's like, if you want it, you have to literally, how do you bring it into reality? What does that look like? And so he was one that, as much as he worked hard, even being this working energy and probably I would say even the dynamics in the relationship, even with my mother, he was the workhorse, right? Could fix anything, do anything on those levels, right? He was very handy in those ways. But he also had this side that was a dreamer and was an entrepreneur. And to find out ways. So even in some of his visions and his dreams, maybe that's what I'll entitle this, Dreams from My Father, because he was definitely a dreamer and loved, even with flying. So, how many people do that it's like he loved airplanes, and he would always go to the air show and all of these things that then he studied. He got his pilot's license. Like, what are the steps that if you want a plane, you don't just sit and wish for it. You take the steps and you do what you need to do. Took his pilot's test. Then when he finally got an opportunity and he bought his little, I think it was a little Cessna 2-seater. And at that point we lived in Fond du Lac. And I remember on Sundays, my brother and we took turns, and on Sundays, because he was always off on Sundays, we would go up in the plane. So we would go to the little local airport and we would fly the plane. And I remember being very, very young. He taught me how to take off. Landing, I think I was too young. I think my brother was old enough where he could take off and land, but I could fly once we were in the air. And this is funny. This is a funny story because this, over the years, just in general, these stories have come out. I remember at a certain point, while his memory and stuff was still there, and some of the stories, I remember saying, because he wanted to take my son Masihi, he wanted to take him flying. He couldn't fly anymore, so his physical body, he couldn't fly, but that was something he wanted, to take him up in the plane. So we were all gonna go to this airport where they'll take you up. You rent the plane for however long and you go up, and, he wanted to have that experience. And I remember the day that we attempted to go physically. Once we got there, he couldn't do it. So that never became a reality. But my experience with my father was, I had those stories, and we would fly and this was the part that came out later, that my mom never knew about. There was a lot of stuff that in general, my mom and my dad were very, very different. And even their dance and their dynamic and their relationship, it's theirs. I have the maturity and the ability to see it objectively. Yeah. And I can speak from, from the angle for me as his daughter, right? Now, I can't say in many realms if I would have chosen him. Well, I know for a fact that I would not have chosen him as a partner in general. There was different aspects to him that were not not at all something that I would say till death do us part. But as a daughter, and because we have our own dynamics and relationships, the plane story, my mom found out like many years as an adult, that she's like, I had no idea you were doing that. That one, he had to really fight with her to get to be able to take us on Sundays, because her aspect and religion is huge. Yeah, my dad never shared her religion, so there was always a division in those things for them, right? And so it was Sunday. Normally we were always in church. And once he got the airplane, and that was the day that you could go flying, my brother and I, it was fantastic because we didn't have to go to church, right? We could take turns. So not only was it fun because we got to get out of church, it was also fun to spend the day with my father. But the aspect that my mom learned much later in life was that when we would fly, he would turn the engine off, right? This could be considered reckless, and just in general, we're still alive and it all turned out fine. But he knew how to roll the plane, like literally roll it, which was fun. It's like being I'm not a huge fan of roller coasters, but like flying or skydiving, like certain things like that. I love it. But he could roll the plane. He would make it drop, like literally, like it's like you kind of go into a nosedive, and then and he would turn it off literally, and then he would turn it back on and then pull up, and we'd fly back up. And it was years, obviously. I think I was in my 40s, and my mom's like, I had no idea that you were doing that. Like, meaning if she had known that, he was also doing tricks and we were kind of being little daredevils in this little Cessna, she was not happy at all, which is also why she didn't know about those things. Yeah, there was also aspects. So the flying, that's to me is a phenomenal memory. I loved it. I even had this little grease monkey suit, like the little suit that you wear, like if you're like working on cars or you're a mechanic or something. And I really remember, I just had fond memories with my dad. And a lot of play, because as much as I said, he was gone and he was always working, because that's where even him being a mail carrier, so that was his one job. But then in order to do all of the other things and to accomplish some of the dreams and things, he owned apartment buildings, was a manager at, some building. Then he eventually, got a cleaning business, a commercial cleaning business. So he had his day job and then the night job, and then hence became the family business, because those were things that we all kind of participated in. But it allowed him then to get the toys and things that he wanted. So whether it was boats and motorcycles and planes, the plane did eventually go away. The plane, he did not put enough gas in it. Yeah, he ran out of gas, which is not like sometimes you wish you'd have a better story. That was one that he always wishes that there was a better story to how his plane was totaled. It wasn't an accident, nobody died, but literally it was a day that he was with my brother and they ran out of gas and he had to land it. He had to do an emergency landing in some farmer's field. And because it had rained and it was wet, however it landed, it totaled the plane. So that was the end of him having an airplane. But I still think it's a good story. It's a good story to tell. What else? Yeah, lots of play. When he wasn't working and we would go on vacation, he was the fun one. And I would also say, because even in the dynamics and the relationship, my mom had more of her issues in the sense of, just her character and personality. That's a whole nother story in itself. But my dad was more patient. And so a lot of times, just even as a kid, my dad was not only, he was my protector, but also in the sense between even with my mom. My mom had a very hot temper and could really go in the ways that she could go. Yeah. And I remember, like, if I broke something. So and this is a story that I think really speaks to who he was. I remember I broke a plate or I broke something, right? And in order to not have my mom's wrath, I hid it. And I put it under under wherever. And then I literally waited for him to come home from work. So I imagine I was probably, 8. And then I just waited, and then by the time he came home, I walked in the door, and as soon as I saw him, like, Dad, and he's like, what's the matter? Just calm down. I can't understand you. What? And I'm like, I broke the plate, and Mom's gonna be so mad. And he's like, don't worry about it. I got it. I'll tell her I did it. And so I can't even tell you the number of times just in life, not even just a plate, but like, okay, if I, ran into a pole with the car or I did something, his energy, what he brought through, as much as there was like stuff, he cared about people. His character and who he was as a person, I really liked that about him. And I liked that he didn't freak out. He was the one that was calm in so many different scenarios, which in many ways, I think I emulated in different ways that I think even in situations, or it does apply in life, whether it's travel or midwifery or just parenting, just in general, that if you're not regulated, if your nervous system and your core is just not grounded, it doesn't make it beautiful for the people that are around you. It is not a joy to be around. And he always had this calm presence and a nonchalance in those stages. Yeah, it was really big. So even if it was a car or whatever, he's like, did you get hurt? Are you okay? Did anybody else get hurt? I liked that about him. He didn't freak out about stuff. Yeah, because as much as it was important, he valued human relationships more. And so I think even on an emotional level, there were things that I could relate to. And that was kind of, again, and maybe, again, my experience is probably very much, my lived and embodied experience is probably very different than what my brother experienced, because we all have different dynamics in relationships, and that's just real, right? So the planes, I do remember, even driving. First of all, I did a lot of things in different aspects, right? But when he took me to drive for the first time, I remember he would take me onto this hill and learning how to drive 5-speed. And he's like, how come you're driving like you've done this before? Because I was driving way before. I had friends that were older than me, and I made it a point to learn to drive 5-speed. And once he realized, he's like, so you don't really need this practice. You've been driving. Okay. And then he said, but he goes, what you do need to learn. And I remember, because again, being from the Midwest and snowstorms and whatever, he's like, but you do need to know how to drive in snow. And so I remember this man, my father, taking me into cul-de-sacs, like into things and spinning out and doing donuts. And like, in the sense, he's like, now I want you to get a hold of the car. You need to learn how to get, when it spins out or you're on ice, how do you spin it? So those were things that I remember him teaching me. And when I had friends over, we could ride the John Deere lawnmower, and just, I think in some ways there was aspects of me being a little bit of a tomboy, in the sense, one, I wanted to be around him because he was more fun to be around. 2, there wasn't this side where like, you're a girl and you can't do it. Do you know? Like he didn't he didn't baby me in ways that if I wanted, which in some ways, if I look at it, as you grow up, yes, he taught me how to change a tire. He taught me how to do a lot of things that I think deep down, if I look at him as a man, his responsibility and being responsible for his wife and his family and all of those things, there was a lot that he instigated with me, especially when it came in the sense of working and to be able to do things, that he showed me probably things because he is a man in those ways, like, well, this is what I can show you how to do. So he taught me the things that he knew how to do. I do also remember at a certain stage when I started to realize, how you're at a certain stage in your growth and development, and you do see, like, with these wide eyes, and you think of your daddy in those ways. And then as I started to get older, I started to see him also from different aspects. This is why I said, as much as I am and was a daddy's girl, as I also grew and matured, and I remember before I bought my house and moved in those ways, I remember, first of all, he and I went skydiving. That was a huge thing. That was an amazing memory. I will never forget it. Because again, whether it was planes or jumping out of them, there was also that exciting side. I think I didn't live with them. So I think I had already bought my house. I maybe would have been 21, I think. And he and we took the course together. Again, here's the dream. Do you want to go skydiving? Yeah, I'll go skydiving. Do you want to go tandem, or do you want to, go on your own? I wanted to go on my own. So you take the class, him as well. And I remember even on that day, my mom, who is a major worrier and fear everything, right? All of the stuff that he loved, she did not, which is also, I think, like a huge plug for anyone in the sense of, like, even your partners in how you choose. I think compatibility is really important. You should have things that you that you enjoy together, and unless that's just the dynamic, whatever. Anyways, my dad and I went skydiving, and my mom chose to come because she said her exact words were, "I am not going to sit home. I do not want either one of you jumping out of airplanes. But I am not going to sit home knowing that you guys are jumping out of the airplane and wait for the phone to ring and somebody to call and say that your husband and your daughter died because they were jumping out of a plane." So she came and watched us begrudgingly. And she didn't get a vote. That's also kind of, the reality of what that was too. Like, certain things as a child, you kind of had to live whatever you had to live. But I was 20 or 21. I just know I didn't live with them, and I remember coming. I think I picked up my dad. I picked him up, and we drove to the place where we were skydiving. That was an amazing memory, and in so many ways, it reminds me of the adventure. And I think even this was well before I had any visions of, like, before I was ever a mother and all the things, but like traveling and different countries, all those things, even though that was not his reality, he never, other than being in the army and some of the places that he traveled when he was in the army, but that's a whole different reality. He was an instigator of that, to that it's, if you have a dream or you have a vision, to do it. You only live once, right? That was a good memory. I love the skydiving. And I would say even towards the end in his dementia and his, health issues, his hearing was phenomenal in the sense that he always, even, we would take these small walks and different things. He could hear what plane, like just by the motor, he could hear what kind of engine it had in the sky. And I think the skydiving and having that memory, there's there's a quote that was written on our skydiving certificates, and it was something about the freedom of flight. This by Da Vinci. Once you've tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward. For there you've been, and there you will always long to return. And I think it's Da Vinci, but I'm not sure. But I remember that even later in his life, because he tasted flight, not only from flying his own airplane, but skydiving, and he would go to the air shows every year. Even this in 2023, he wanted to go to the air show to see the bombers and the whatever. He just loved it. And I think when I remember kind of putting some stories together too, I think some of the stories he told my son was that when he was in the Army, he was a pilot, and that he did something which was totally not true. But it was a story that was probably also wishful thinking / dementia, that also part of having a little bit of a distance from things. It's not necessary always to correct one. So if he was able to convince his grandson that he had a special part in some of the, I don't even think it was wartime. I don't know. Some of the stories, I'm like, well, that doesn't really make sense, but okay, we'll just go with it. And yeah, at those ages. And that's where I would say, even too, there were things that at different stages, that even for me, I'm glad that my son got a chance to know him before he was no longer my father, right? So again, I think that makes sense to anybody who knows what ambiguous loss is, and when one's kind of literally shapeshift into a different being in person, right? What else? This is where I kind of wanted to go. The transitions of like when you become an adult and then your eyes kind of start to shift a little bit in like, okay, this man who you looked up to as your father, always respect. I have always had a deep respect for the man who raised me. Absolutely. But there were specific times as I was growing and maturing, and then even in life, like with my business, that was huge. I remember working at Mequon Myotherapy Clinic, and it was my first job as a massage therapist after I got out of school. And building a practice, and just like anything, I mean, it happened, and even clients, I built my practice very, very quickly. But when it was time for me there was the possibility of starting my own practice or staying where I was at. I remember when I would ask my dad for advice, and there was always the two sides. This is why also in the sense of the mother and father play different roles, right? So it's where there's no competition. It's just what it is, right? And you can choose, even in life, who you pay attention to, like what voice is important at different ages and stages. And I mean, even on a level of rites of passage, it is just what it is. There's times where you're in alignment with the feminine, and then you naturally start to step back from the feminine. You align more with the masculine, and then you return, and then it's just part of it. It's part of life. It's part of the passage. But I remember when I was contemplating starting my own business, and I remember I would complain. I would say, and this, the woman who owned the business, she took 50% of what we made. And in the beginning, it was fine because I was building a practice and they were busy and it was what it was, blah, blah, blah. But then after a while, that entrepreneurial spirit and his energy, he remember him saying to me, he's like, I don't want to hear it. He's like, you're making, it was always about money too. Like what was also like realistic and logical, I would complain to my mom about certain dynamics and certain things. My mom, I could complain and she would be like, yeah, and I could get away with it. My dad, I would go to him and say, he's like, if you're going to complain, I told you what to do. I told you, you have enough clients. You've been there for 2 years. Work for yourself, rent a place, do it on your own. He's like, I don't want to hear it. Either do it on your own or go complain to your mother, which was kind of the energy. And then if I would go to my mother, she would say, well, you're only 20 years old and you're making, I don't know, even at the time, let's say a massage was probably $50 an hour and you're making $25 an hour. That's really good. I would stay, like safety, comfort. I would stay. And my dad's like, work for yourself. And because of that instigation, my business partner and I at that time, we like, can we do this? Let's do this. We moved down the street, opened our practice, and within one day of moving, all of our clients followed us, and I got a 50% raise, went from $25 an hour to $50. And my dad was like, see, this is what I'm talking about. And same with the house, like it's better to buy, like at that time, it's better to buy than rent, because then you can, you have your tax, you can write off your property taxes, you write off, blah, blah, blah. All those things came from my father. And, I took them, like it was one of the things that I really had a lot of pride in, and having a different experience. So this is where I would say, like, even for my mother, her experience was literally going from her parents' house to her husband's house, in the sense that she went from her parents' house and then got married and then moved into her husband's house. So she never had the experience of being in her own space, and what happens also in that level of growth and, you know what I mean, being outside of not being married in those ways. And I think even at the time, if I'm really honest, I was born in 1976. So I think it was in 1988. It wasn't until 1988 that women were even allowed to own their own businesses. So there were certain things, like everything had to go through the father's name or the husband's name or whatever. So there was a lot of things that I think my dad was an instigator of with me, but I think some of that was because he did feel a huge amount of pressure in certain ways. And so he wanted me to have the freedom, or like if he wasn't there, So, I mean, if we fast forward, even just in general, as much as I know how to change a tire, I'll call someone and someone will change the tire. But if I had to, I could, and that's why I think it's also been interesting in the transitions, for my mother, being that this is the first time at 83 years old, her experience of living on her own and different things of what that looks like, right? And I know for a fact, and even my roles, I came in, as a midwife and hospice nurse, whatever, in those ways with my father. But I wasn't cutting the lawn. I wasn't shoveling the snow. There's ones that call who have those businesses. Do you know what I mean? So that is, I think, again, you can have the ability to do it. But as I grew and I matured and there were certain things, I'm like, but I can do that, but I don't really want to. So hence, even for me, my house, it was a condo. I didn't do those things there either. There was a company that came and plowed the snow. I parked in the garage, whatever. There's always ways. But I wanted to speak a little bit of, so like my first, well, I had a lot of cars, but that was also something that he was always like the one, like I remember getting a Dodge Dakota, and I wanted this truck, right? And so he was, well, let me go with you, because, he's the man, and, he'll get the best deal kind of thing. And I remembered at a certain age in my early 20s, I remember looking at my father and going, I think I'm outgrowing him. Because I realized after we negotiated and all the stuff, what he did, I realized when I went home and checked like Kelley Blue Book and just different things, and then realized I'm like, I didn't get a good deal, because he didn't have access to the internet and a lot of the things that are available now, that in general, when you do your research about anything, if it's car, if it's a birth, if it's like you do your research. And so the fact that we have technology in the ways that we do, I do remember the next vehicle that I got, because that was, different stages and phases. I went from having a truck to wanting a sports car. So that was an aspect. But I remember at that point, and this was kind of a little contention from, like, he was not happy with me when I drove to their house with my new Acura. He was not happy at all. Like, how did you get it? Why didn't you call me? And I remember at the time, my business partner, her husband, I remember saying, this is going to be the first time, in the sense, like, I want to go and I want to get this car, but I'd like you to come with me, but I want to do the speaking. I don't want it to be the boys club or just in general. I've done my research. I know what I should pay, like all the things, but would you come with me for moral support? And my business partner's husband was amazing in those ways. There wasn't the old grid, energy that sometimes, like even with my dad, he was old school. That was his reality. Even my mom, to be like, just to kind of give you a little context as well, my mother never put gas. I remember having to show her how to do gas and to put gas in her car. My dad always filled her tank. Do you know what I mean? Like, would take the car to go fill it up. That then there was a certain period of time in the last years that was something. She's like, well, how do I work this? I'm like, and then you put your card in, like different things, and here's the pump, like whatever. She just didn't do it because of their roles, which I also in some ways is beautiful, as well. But again, even for my mother and I, we had very different realities and experiences of what our life was about. But I remember when I came back from getting the car, or not that day probably, but I drove to their house, and it's like, and he was really, I could see the sadness on his face that his little girl did not call him to go get the car. But that was also one of the decisions that I had to make, that I'm like, well, I don't want to get a horrible price. And I realized that I did kind of take a pretty big hit and paid more than I should have for the last vehicle. And it was a little bit of pride. It was something that a lot of things I wanted to do. And had, negotiated, the 5-year lease on the office and just different things. There's certain sides of my being that I took a lot of pride in. That was an aspect to my, I don't know, I think it's a balance. I think it's just part of it. I got that from him. But I realized there was a certain age and stage where it was like it was starting to shift. And that had nothing to do with dementia. I also remember the first trip he and I took together. Again, I had to be mid-20s, and we went to go see my brother and his kids in Colorado. And at that point, I had been doing a lot of traveling, not only for, like, I was doing trance, I was doing facilitating different workshops, mostly connected to trance dance and different things that he had no understanding of. This is where, even to him being out of his body, there's many conversations that he and I have now in real time that he's like, I had no idea that was a part of your reality. Even a lot of the mystical stuff and voidal space, liminal space stuff, he had no idea in real time a lot of aspects of who his daughter was, right? But that's also just kind of part of the play, and it's fine. But I remember we went to the airport, and he was not someone who flew. So I was flying all the time. Before I became a mother, as much as I had my home and my massage practice and all of that, but before I became a mom and began world schooling, traveling in those ways, I traveled a lot in the United States. So flying was normal. He hadn't flown since he was in the Army. Otherwise, they mostly did like road trips and things. He loved to drive. He loved to drive. So hence, when he could no longer drive and didn't have access and a lot of the freedoms that he had in many ways, that was not beautiful for him. So hence the ones who, again, understand that when you no longer have your freedom and whether it's in your physical body or being able to drive and different things, it is a blessing. It is a blessing to be able to move to the other side, right? But I remember the trip that I took with him when we went to go see my brother, and he was so stubborn. And like, I remember thinking then I could kind of see through my mom's eyes in different ways. I'm like, this man is so stubborn. If he doesn't know, he won't admit it. And it's like, there was so many aspects. And I remember after that trip, I saw him from such a different angle. And I remember saying to my mom, so this is an aspect too. Again, it was very secret while he was alive, but I don't have any shame. And I think mental illness is also something that should be discussed. And if we go a little bit deeper, a lot of times there's trauma, but in his family, right? There is mental illness. He was diagnosed bipolar, manic depressive. And again, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't really know about, because I think it got worse once he retired, and I didn't live there. So when I say that I traveled with him and the experience that I had when we went to Colorado, I remember when I came back, I looked at my mom, I'm like, there's no way in hell I would have said that I would say till death do us part with who that was, So again, here's these aspects where you can see this little daddy's girl, and here's what it's like as a child, and here's that. And then as he started to age, and I also think once he retired, there was a lot more space, that there was unprocessed emotions, things from childhood. So again, I can't speak like across the board. Everybody, it's very specific to each person. But there was a lot of trauma. But I will say the conversation, even with my mom and him, and it was open, right? In the sense that it was a blessing also that they could not physically have children because of the history that is in my father, the one who raised me, in his bloodline. And then also my mom who raised me, in her bloodline. There were things that literally that would not, it's perfect. It's perfect, right? And again, we all have our origin story. So again, that's all what it is. But I got to see my father on that trip as a man, and kind of start to put two and two together, like different things in aspects of his being and personality, again, I think for most people, it's important, mental health and history in those ways. It's important that those things are known. And I think later, and I do remember this also even with my mother, I remember saying at a certain point, once I realized, and then I think she told me, but she wasn't supposed to tell me. It was like this big secret. So he wasn't diagnosed as bipolar, bipolar 1, I think, until he retired, until his 50s. But I do think that played a lot into, and then him, like even his physical body and health. So then he was on a lot of meds and a lot of things that then over the years had to keep being adjusted. So hence then you bring in Parkinson's, and then you bring in diet, and you bring in all kinds of things. He was not at all the free being, and the one that my little girl self was absolutely in awe of. It was like a steady decline in so many different ways, and then depression and all the things. But I do remember saying to my mom at a specific point, because I had an extra bedroom, and I said, if you decide that you are not going to do till death do us part, right, as far as honoring your marriage vows, you don't have to worry about it. You can live with me. That was my thing, because after I traveled with him and I got to know a little bit more him as a man, outside of father, right? you get to see different aspects and the humanness of it. This doesn't even like defame him in any way, even of his memory of this. This is life. This is reality, you know? And so I think even in that, and even over the years, there were just so many things that I got to see from different angles. And it doesn't take away from my childhood memories of him. It doesn't take away from any of it. I have a card when I was going through all of helping my mom with stuff after he died, went through some boxes and things, and there was a card that I sent to him for Father's Day, one of the years, yeah. And I have it. It says, "Happy Father's Day to the man who taught me what life is all about." And then you open it up and it says, "Could you repeat it? I wasn't listening." Which is also kind of very much even part of our banter. So as I grew into an adult too, I don't know, there were so many things. Like he was able to come to visit me, you know, like we could have conversations on many different levels, and things that I never even knew about, right? But as far as like this card of like, I wasn't listening, I go on to write in this card, it's like the things that I was listening to. Start your own business. Check. Work for yourself. Check. Work hard, play harder. Check. Find something to do that you love and get paid for it. Check. Don't sweat the small stuff and don't take shit from anybody. Check. Take care of your mother when I'm gone. Check. And then I put, I was listening. Yeah. Now, the other side of the card, I wrote, these are the things that I didn't listen to. Don't go there. So that was Africa. Like there was huge issues. Like don't go there. When I was going to sell my house and like, this is the vision. Here's what I'm doing. It was a huge thing. But again, you didn't get a vote. The vision comes to me and I move with spirit in the way that I do. But he said, don't go to Africa. I did not listen. Don't go to Germany. I didn't listen. Don't go to Mexico. Because basically you can also hear in these things, it was him also seeing me as the little girl and having no idea. Like he didn't even really know like what a midwife was, what a sangoma, healer, all the other things that I do. Other than massage therapy, which was the very first thing for me at 18 years old. Other than that, all of the other things that I do and how I work and my practice and what I live as my own being, he had no understanding of whatsoever. And then I put at the bottom of this, I said, do I regret? Oh, then he put, don't cross the road. Like, so Pilgrim and Mill Road, don't cross the road with the dog. This was later on as the dementia and Alzheimer's was advancing. He was getting more and more like, even on some levels. I mean, he would watch all these old cowboys and stuff. And so he'd say something, he'd be like, that's an order. And at certain stages, you kind of have to choose and creatively learn how to disobey, because that's, whatever. So in this card, do I regret ignoring your warnings? And it says, I had many adventures, met amazing soul family and friends, felt very alive. And then I put selective listening as it pertains to my life experiences. But my love, appreciation, and respect for you as my father has never wavered. I love and honor you. Happy Father's Day. And that really, I do think that kind of sums up our nature, like our dance in it. As much as I remember telling this story before I sold my house, literally received the vision. I think I had been at 7 days in Hawaii doing trance, and I literally was going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Came back, had the vision. I'm like, I'm selling my house, but I don't see a moving truck. Like, again, how you receive visions and all those things. And just, I moved, like I literally, it's like when I get when I get the information, I don't need it to make sense to anybody else. It's part of my path as a mystic. It's part of how I move pasra with spirit in those ways. But I remember when I came and I said, I'm moving and I'm going to go to, and I didn't know anybody. Here's the stuff. It was, I sold my house, closed on my house. I stayed with my parents for 11 days. And then flew to Ghana. So that was like the first time I had stayed at their house since I had moved. So it was, it was a big thing. My dad was taking me to the airport. And I remember before we left, it was a huge argument. And it was because he was afraid for his little girl. And I remember thinking at that time, like, this man is your father, this is the person who raised you, and he wants to keep you safe. Just let him have his moment. Just let him say what he's going to say. And I remember it being huge drama. This is also why when I do return to the Midwest and it's about like coming to my parents' house, I always fly direct. I fly to Chicago and I take the space and time exiting and entering, just to kind of ground and attune my own energies to be able to walk into the space. But I remember my father, before he was taking me to the airport, and I always take an Uber. Like, I do not allow for energies that I don't wish to be a send-off. I do it in my own space. So that's also what life teaches in those ways. But I remember him saying, he's like, and he goes, and you're going to Africa. He goes, I can save you a trip. The world is shit. People are shit. It's not safe. Like, something he was going on. And I remember I was so dramatic. And I remember going, but if that's true, then kill me now. Because I don't want to live in a world like that. Right? And then I remember my mom sitting there going, Bob, please stop. She's never going to come back. It was so dramatic. And then, put my suitcases in the car. He still agreed to take me to to Amtrak, because then I flew out of Chicago, and then 11 days, and then I was in Ghana and began the sojourn that was exactly ordained for me in the ways that it was meant to be. And I remember years later, a neighbor who, when I would come back to visit and he would look at me and be like, all the places that you've been and your travels and something. And he was looking at me like wide-eyed, and my dad was standing there and he was like in the ways. And I remember putting my arm around my dad and I said, but now, how would you feel if your daughter decided after, many years of her, like success in the ways of like business and, she's doing well, here's all these things. And then she lets go of all of it to go to travel where she doesn't know anyone, is apprenticing as a traditional healer, a midwife, all the things. How would you feel? And then when he thought about it, and he thought about his own daughter and his own projections of like, no, she's going to be this, like, I said, so then you can see it. Yeah. Cause he's like, how did you feel about it? I said, ask my father. And he was sitting there. He had blocked it out, I think. He had blocked out some of the response of that, because at that point, like, all was well, return. This was many years years later. But it's interesting. Those are still parts of the story. Those are still a part of, like, it wasn't all beautiful. And there's certain aspects. I do think, I do remember. Yeah, there's different things, but I would say overall, my father is somebody that, especially as a little girl, when we would go canoeing or we would do stuff, we played. I just also remember playing a lot and water skiing and a lot of those things. And he as much as he also was very strong in he had a lot of pride. And because he was raised by a single mother and he saw her working so hard, he was so adamant that that was not going to be his wife, that he was going to do better than his father. And he was even adopted at one point by his stepfather. But there was not a lot of beauty in his relationship. So I think also, if I'm really honest, I see different things that came out in my father in his parenting. He was a fatherless child. And there was not like men in the community or the village, right? Those are also things that are also very important, that even if your physical, or biological, or again, even in my case, the one that I'm speaking of is not my biological father, he is not my blood, but he was, and my mom as well, were very adamant. It's like, just because we don't have your blood does not mean that we don't love you. And here's that. So, that was one of my very first lessons. And so a lot of the things, even as I say, we were very different. But then as I traveled, because I was also making peace and going to the places that were a part of my bloodline, as well as following the path, the sojourn that I was called to. But because of who he was and because of how I was raised, I realized that blood does not determine your family. And even in this now moment, I'm 48 years old and I cannot even comprehend, had I not gone on the sojourn and followed my path in the ways that I have. There's soul family and friends that are literally sprinkled all over this globe that showed me that even the things that he was absolutely like, don't go, and his fears, or because they also watch a lot of news, they would always, that was a huge part of their reality, like TVs and news, and that's not mine, I'm aware of the things that are happening, but there's so many things that are behind the scenes that are also happening that you don't see. And I, in my real life reality, got to experience that what you see on the news that's not even a fraction of what I experienced, and how, especially when you work with dreams and you work in the ways that you do, and you see how spirit brings you to specific people and for reasons, and that you are always protected. And even in different aspects, it's like there's also not a fear of death, because, we could have died jumping out of an airplane, skydiving, or a car accident, or whatever. So anyways, no, I think that's it. Yeah, there is going to be another edition that will just come from the aspects and the space that I got to hold as a midwife, because his death was also really beautiful. And there's things that, again, some of my understanding and knowledge in working as a channel and as a medium and connecting with spirit in those ways, there was amazing things that he got to go through. And it's a space that, again, even in our family, there are certain ones that show up to do certain things. And like I said, I really knew long before my dad was going to leave his body that was a role that I would play for him. And on the flip side, there's a lot of psychic things that came on even stronger by working with some of those energies in the Voidal Mothers. So there's always more. There's always more. And now that he has transitioned, and also beyond the well, in Zulu, it's like uthumzi, like of how you prepare, like his last rites, all of the things that were part of, it's not even just when they die, and the hospice nurse of like between like those roles for his end of life transition. There's also the stages that you hold the space when they're crossing over, so they can actually like actually like their spirit and soul is purified, so they can become a benevolent ancestral spirit. Because there's a lot of things, there's just in general, it's important to kind of take care of those things if you can before you go. He had a lot of dis-ease in his mind and in his spirit, so it was a lot even after he died. But it was an assignment. And one of his things when he came through, when he finally kind of like transitioned, and again, I'm talking after death, right? These are the other spaces. But the very first thing he said to me was, he said, I am so proud of you and of how I handled as well. Like, this is also too, my calm. I am my own tree of life. I have ways to access and balance my own energies and my own bodies in different ways. It's probably why even the only form of body work that I will still do to this day is cranial sacral, because I find it just to be amazing in the sense of, you know, being able to be deeply rooted, because then you're able to handle things that some people would just be freaking out. You're able to just be so anchored and grounded that it looks to the outside world effortless. And his compliment to me was, because he saw also from the other side, this was after he left his body and after his transition, he saw what 2023 and what his end of life was, because he couldn't see it when he was in the body. You know, there was also different aspects. There was some things literally where it's almost like a child, though, where you have to keep them safe. That, you know, there's a difference between you have kids and here's this dynamic, but then when you're literally the amount of patience and creativity that you have to have with one who was on a hierarchical level, right? Your you know, your superior, your father in that way, and then having to make calls and decisions where it's like, no, you don't get a vote. I was going to say voice, but a vote. There was many times there was things, you know, that weren't so beautiful, but the way that I handled it and can literally just hold the space. I think this is where there's a creativity. I think I said that I wasn't going to really talk about some of that end of life, the death stuff, but I think this is funny. I think it's funny. There was things that he, you know, again, between you couldn't have the car keys and just different things, and then forgetting, and then all the things, right? And he was a sugar addict. So he was not a drinker, but to me in life, everybody knows that sugar is more addictive than alcohol. And so it is what it is. And at the end of his life, especially with him not having freedom of movement, I think there's a lot of stuff like even dementia, different things can be induced by sugar. So people who are really like about being in their bodies, I think you should really pay attention. Might be wise to pay attention to what you're putting in your body and how it fuels you and what it does to the brain. But he was already at 83 years old. It is what it is. There's no like turning over a new leaf, whatever. So in many ways, I was also his drug dealer. And drugs, I'm talking about sugar. Yeah. And so I would, in the ways that I could get by some of those things, and especially once he didn't even recognize me, he just kind of thought I was the nurse. I would, you know, he would have episodes of like, you know, he wanted to get in the car, he wanted to do these things, and I would distract him, give him sugar, and he'd be like, oh, where did we get this? I remember a friend came over and he looked at him, he goes, I think this is the happiest I've ever seen your dad. And it was because he was hiding. And, you know, he would be like, don't tell my mother, which was his wife, right? He was thinking she was his mother. But about the sugar, like all of it, I could hold that space and I could literally show up and be the nurse and be, you know, the things. And I didn't take it personally. You know, I didn't have a banter, or if he was doing stuff and it was like literally it made no sense. I literally I'm not doing that. Like I didn't think, oh, he's my father and I have to listen. I had an objective ability to handle it. But when he crossed over, I remember him saying, I am so proud of how you handled all of that, because he was able to see it. He was able to see what was actually happening when he left his body. Like, a while after, he could see it from a different angle. And in many ways, this is where I will say, for ones that, depending upon what the dynamic or the relationship is with your parent, if they're embodied, if they're still living, even once they cross over, sometimes the relationship can grow and expand in ways that you get to have conversations that you were never able to have before. Yeah. So this is where, again, spirit is eternal and it is fun. This is where even in real time, some of the aspects in our conversation now, and even as I get to know things more about him and his soul and his spirit, and vice versa, he gets to see me, and there's aspects that he's like, I never knew that you knew this stuff. But then I think at the same time, there was a lot of things, even through the dementia, like I would sing in, there's a song that I would sing that it, like when I'm channeling, there's certain sounds and there's certain things that I'll do. And I remember singing that. He's like, what is that song? What is that language like? So there was always a part of his consciousness and spirit that could hear certain things. And then once his active dying phase and things happened, I just had I had a ball, because it was also like in it, there was no more like this disconnect between the worlds. Once his active dying, and there was like this kind of a surrender, and I'm sure also the morphine helped, but it was much easier because he was such a strong-willed. His power, even from different surgeries and different things, like sometimes they would give him something and they're like, this is supposed to make him go to sleep. But what it did to him was the exact opposite. And if you've ever experienced someone who literally, if it's like you could blow them over, like they're weak, they're frail, like whatever. But there were times where he would have like this strength that came out of like beyond the beyond. So once he was actually in his active dying phase, and then I could just revert to the midwife and, angel of death and all the things, and the rituals, rites of passage, all the things. That's my element. And that was one of the things that he really said. He thanked me and honored me. And I, like I said from the beginning, it was an absolute honor to hold that space for him, because that was the man who held significant space for me growing up. And I am so grateful. All right. I think that's all I want to say about Robert Anthony Burlesic. How about we end with a poem? This is by Langston Hughes. I like this. Okay. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? Langston Hughes. And I think the reason that was profound for me is that there's so much about the actual death process and what the body knows how to do. The body knows how to birth. The body knows what to do during birth. Like that's very innate, primal, natural. Death as well. I really think it's an amazing transition. And for ones, if you can have that, if you can actually think about that and have conversations with the ones that you love, if it is not your skill set to be able to hold those spaces, this is where hospice is your friend, and to really normalize it. I also think just as much as birth is coming more and like families are getting involved and it's like, okay, no, this is a normal rite of passage. I would hope that people begin bringing, like, talking about death and really being clear about certain things. And it can be it can be beautiful. I don't know. I think it can be beautiful. I think that's it. That's all I got to say about that. Dreams from my father. I think that's what I'm going to entitle this. Dreams from my father. Peace, peace, and more peace.